I want you to just think about your morning today. You woke up, maybe you made some coffee, checked your phone, and walked out the door. Now imagine if, right as you stepped outside, you noticed a car parked across the street. Ordinarily, you wouldn't care at all. But today, this profound, unshakable feeling just washes over you that the car is there specifically for you.
Oh, yeah. Like it's an undeniable fact to you.
Right. The license plate is sending you a message. The barista at the coffee shop isn't just handing you a cup, they're like signaling to someone in the corner.
Yeah.
Suddenly the reality you've always known is just fracturing. And usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, right? You break an arm, an x-ray shows the jagged line, and the doctor says, boom, there it is.
Right. It's very objective.
Exactly. But when you ask a question like, what does it actually mean to lose touch with reality? That x-ray machine is completely useless. We are suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
It really is. I mean, when you step into the world of the human mind, that black and white clarity just vanishes entirely. We're dealing with subjective experience, which, makes pinning it down to a neat little medical chart incredibly difficult.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We've got this massive stack of source material, medical history, psychiatric frameworks, some really eye-opening modern clinical research, and we are going to unpack what psychosis actually is. We really need to separate the clinical reality from the Hollywood tropes you've almost certainly seen.
Oh, definitely. There are so many of those.
Right, and we want to explore how our understanding of the mind has radically shifted over the last, 150 years. To start, I want to address the elephant in the room. I think if you stopped 100 people on the street right now and asked them what psychosis is, most of them would probably say it's having a split personality, or that it's just, another word for schizophrenia.
Which is arguably one of the most pervasive misunderstandings in all of medicine. We really have to start by pulling those concepts apart. First off, psychosis is not a diagnosis.
Wait, it's not?
No, it's a state. It is a temporary or sustained loss of shared reality. Clinically, it's defined by 3 core symptom clusters. The first is hallucinations, which is perceiving something that fundamentally isn't there in the physical room.
Okay, so hearing voices is the classic example we always see in media.
Yes, auditory hallucinations are definitely the most common. But it can be visual, seeing things. It can be tactile, like feeling bugs crawling under your skin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it can even be olfactory, smelling smoke or poison that just isn't there. The brain is processing sensory input that does not exist in the physical world.
Okay, so if hallucinations are false sensory inputs, what's the second cluster?
Delusions. These are fixed, false beliefs. And the key word there really is fixed. These are beliefs held with this absolute, unbreakable conviction. They are entirely resistant to contrary evidence.
Okay, I actually want to push back on that for a second. Because we all know people who have completely irrational beliefs, right? People who believe the earth is flat or who just stubbornly refuse to admit they're wrong in an argument despite being shown the facts. Where's the line between intense stubbornness and a clinical delusion?
That's a crucial distinction, actually. Stubbornness, or say conspiracy theories, are usually shared by a community. You can go online and find 1,000 other people who believe the earth is flat. A clinical delusion is typically highly idiosyncratic and deeply, deeply personal.
Like it's just about them.
Exactly. It's a conviction that your specific neighbor is using a microwave beam to steal your specific thoughts. And no matter how much proof you offer, even if you tear down the walls to show there's no machine, the person cannot be argued out of it. The belief is structurally bolted into their reality.
Got it. That makes sense. And the third symptom cluster?
Disorganized thinking and speech. This is where the cognitive architecture just starts to loosen up. A person's associative threads become completely tangential. They might answer a question with a completely unrelated string of words. It's often called word salad because the brain's ability to logically sequence thoughts has broken down.
Okay, so you have these 3 symptoms: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking. But earlier you said psychosis is a state, not a diagnosis. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that.
Right. Think about how a doctor treats a fever. A fever tells you something is wrong in the body. It's a warning sign.
Yeah.
But a fever doesn't tell you if you have the flu or a bacterial infection or heat stroke. Psychosis is essentially the brain's fever. It is a sign that something is misfiring, but those symptoms aren't unique to one specific illness.
So experiencing psychosis is basically a check engine light for the human brain.
Exactly. It's a check engine light. It shows up as schizophrenia, yes. But that same check engine light comes on during severe bipolar manic episodes, severe depression, sleep deprivation, brain tumors. It can be triggered by drug intoxication or even late-stage dementia. The state of psychosis is just the shared presentation of many different underlying problems.
Wow. Okay, so if it's a check engine light, I want to look under the hood for a minute. What exactly is mechanically misfiring in the brain to cause these specific terrifying symptoms? Like, why the intense beliefs? Why the voices?
To understand the mechanics of it, the sources point us to this highly influential model proposed in 2003 by a psychiatrist named Shiti Kapoor. It's called the salience, or prediction error model. Kapoor basically argued that psychosis fundamentally stems from a dysregulated dopamine system.
Dopamine. Okay, usually if you read any pop science article, dopamine is just described as the reward chemical. It's the hit you get when someone likes your photo on social media.
Right, and it does play a huge role in reward. But dopamine has another job that is arguably much more critical for our survival, and that is assigning salience.
Salience.
Yes, salience is the brain's highlighting tool. It's a chemical tag that says, this piece of information matters. Pay attention to this. If you hear a loud crack in a quiet room, your brain spikes dopamine to make that sound highly salient, so you react.
Okay.
In a healthy brain, salience is assigned appropriately. But in a psychotic state, that system goes completely haywire. A dysregulated dopamine system starts mistakenly assigning massive, intense salience to ordinary, totally neutral things.
Okay, let me see if I'm tracking this. If I'm walking down the street, my brain is constantly filtering out a million pieces of data, right? The sound of traffic, a flickering street light, a guy in a red hat walking past me. But if my dopamine system is dysregulated, it's randomly highlighting those things. So the guy in the red hat isn't just a guy anymore. My brain is screaming, pay attention to him. This is incredibly important.
You've got it. Imagine living in that reality. Imagine a flood of false significance. Mundane moments are suddenly injected with terrifying meaning. It is just overwhelming. And this is where Kapoor's model gets really fascinating regarding delusions specifically. We tend to think of delusions as the primary malfunction, like the brain is just making up a crazy story.
Yeah, that's what I always thought.
But under the salience model, the delusion is actually the mind's desperate attempt to make sense of the corrupted signals.
Wait, so the logic center of the brain isn't necessarily broken, it's just trying to solve a puzzle using completely corrupted data.
Yes, exactly. The reasoning process is trying to connect the dots. If your brain is telling you with absolute chemical certainty that the flickering streetlight and the guy in the red hat are deeply, monumentally connected to you, your mind has to build a narrative to explain why. The delusion is the explanation bolted onto the irrational signal.
That is mind-blowing. It completely reframes what a delusion is. It's not the brain breaking down. It's the brain working overtime to protect you from the chaos. It's building a life raft out of bad information.
Beautifully put.
But if everyone's brain is basically doing the same mechanical thing, trying to build a story out of false salience, what do those stories actually look like in practice? Because they can't all be the same.
They aren't. And this brings up a really important distinction in psychiatry. The difference between the form of a delusion and the content of a delusion. The form stays remarkably constant across all of human history. It's always a highly systematized, fixed, false belief that resists evidence. But the content, the actual characters and plot of the delusion, that changes depending on what era the person lives in.
Because the brain just grabs whatever cultural ingredients are lying around to build the story.
Exactly, the cultural pantry, so to speak. Let's look at a few examples from the sources. In 1903, you have a famous case, Daniel Paul Schreber, a German judge. He spent years in psychiatric care and wrote this incredibly detailed memoir about his delusions. Schreber believed he was being transformed into a woman in order to repopulate the world after a cosmic divine catastrophe.
Okay, so early 20th century. The cultural pantry is stocked with religion, mythology, cosmic events.
Right. Now fast forward to 1959. Think about the Nobel laureate John Nash, the mathematician, whose life was depicted in A Beautiful Mind. He developed paranoid schizophrenia. But his delusions weren't about cosmic deities. He believed he was receiving coded messages from extraterrestrials and that he was fighting a secret world government.
Because it's 1959, it's the Cold War. Aliens, espionage, and government conspiracies are on the front page of every newspaper. The brain uses that framework to explain the false salience.
Exactly. Now bring it into the 21st century. In 2008, psychiatrists Joel and Ian Gold identified a pattern they called the Truman Show delusion.
Like the Jim Carrey movie.
Yes, it's not an official diagnosis, but it's a specific type of delusional content where patients firmly believe their entire life is a staged reality television show, complete with hidden cameras, and everyone around them, their family, their doctors, are just hired actors.
That is deeply unsettling, but it makes perfect sense. If you feel constantly watched because your dopamine is misfiring and you live in a world of reality TV and surveillance cameras everywhere, your brain says, ah, I must be on a hidden camera show. It's incredible how adaptable the mind is. But honestly, if the content of Psychosis keeps shape-shifting like that through history, I can't imagine how frustrating it must have been for early doctors trying to categorize it. Before we had brain scans and dopamine models, how did they even begin to label this?
It was a very messy evolution, to say the least. Going back to 1845, an Austrian doctor named Ernst von Feuchtersleben coined the term psychosis. At the time, neurosis was a popular term for nervous disorders, where the patient still knew they were ill. They had insight. Feuchtersleben needed a word for when the disease affected the psyche itself. A total break from shared reality.
So for a long time, doctors just had this giant bucket labeled insanity or psychosis.
Pretty much. But in the 1890s, a German psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin revolutionized the field. He realized that if you just walk into an asylum and look at patients on a Tuesday, you can't categorize them properly because symptoms fluctuate. A patient might be calm today and hallucinating tomorrow. Kraepelin argued you have to categorize mental illness by its prognosis, the long-term trajectory of the disease over a person's life.
Looking at the whole movie instead of just a single freeze frame.
Exactly. And based on that long-term view, he split severe mental illness into two main camps. One he called manic depressive insanity, for patients who had severe episodes but could return to a baseline in between. The other he called dementia precox, which basically translates to premature dementia. This is for patients who seem to suffer a steady, progressive downward decline starting in their youth.
So how did we get from dementia precox to the word schizophrenia? Because those don't sound related at all.
That shift happened a few years later, in 1908, thanks to a Swiss psychiatrist named Eugen Bleuler. Bleuler pushed back on Kraepelin. He said, wait, these patients don't always inevitably decline. I've seen some improve. So he wanted a name that described the internal mechanics of the illness, not just a doomed prognosis. He chose schizophrenia, from the Greek words schizo meaning split and smilin meaning mind.
And right there is the origin of the massive public misunderstanding we talked about at the beginning. If the literal translation is split mind, it is no wonder that the average person confuses it with having a split personality. That has to be one of the worst medical branding disasters in history.
It's an absolute disaster. It's so deeply entrenched that dictionaries literally have to include notes clarifying the misuse. Bleuler was not talking about split personalities. He was talking about a splitting between mental functions.
Can you break down what that actually means? Like, what functions are splitting?
Sure. Bleuler defined this with his famous 4 A's. First, loosened associations. That's the disorganized thinking we talked about earlier. Second, blunted affect. Affect is how you display emotion. So a patient might describe something incredibly tragic, but their face is completely blank. The emotion has split from the expression.
Wow, okay. And the other two?
Third is ambivalence, but not just being indecisive. It's a paralyzing clinical inability to choose between two opposing thoughts. And fourth, autism.
Wait, autism? As in the developmental spectrum disorder we know today?
No, and that's another historical quirk. Bleuler actually coined the word, but he meant it literally as a withdrawal into the self, an intense retreat into an inner fantasy world, detached from external reality. He actually believed these 4 things were the core of schizophrenia, and that hallucinations and delusions were just secondary side effects.
That desire to neatly categorize everything, first-rank symptoms, the 4 A's, drawing hard lines between sanity and insanity, it feels very rigid. And looking at the modern research in our sources, it seems like the entire field is starting to rethink that hard line. What if the boundary between reality and psychosis isn't a brick wall at all?
This is perhaps the most radical shift in modern psychiatry. For decades, the diagnostic manuals treated psychosis as binary. You are on one side of the line or the other. But in the 21st century, researchers like Jim Van Oss championed the continuum model. They looked at massive data sets and found something astounding. Roughly 5 to 8% of the general population experiences psychotic-like events at some point in their lives.
Wait, 5 to 8%. If you are listening to this right now, that means you probably know someone who has experienced this, or maybe you even have yourself.
Without a doubt. Millions of perfectly healthy people might be falling asleep and hear someone clearly shout their name in an empty room. Or they might go through a period of intense stress and feel a fleeting, irrational certainty that they're being followed. The continuum model argues that psychosis isn't a separate, alien thing. It's a dimension of human experience, and we all sit somewhere on that spectrum. The clinical disorder, schizophrenia, or severe bipolar just represents the extreme, persistent, and distressing end of that dial.
So a hallucination doesn't inherently mean you're broken.
Not necessarily. And this was powerfully validated by the hearing voices movement. This started in the 1980s with a Dutch psychiatrist, Marius Rome, and a patient named Patsy Haig. Haig essentially told her psychiatrist, "I hear voices, but why do you insist it's a medical disease if I can learn to live with them?" They conducted surveys and found a substantial minority of people who hear voices regularly but function perfectly well.
Really?
Yeah, they hold jobs, they have families, they never enter psychiatric care.
How's that possible? If you're hearing voices, how do you not end up in distress?
Because they found ways to cope through personal meaning-making. They might interpret the voices as a spiritual guide or just a quirky part of their internal monologue. They didn't try to medically suppress them, they integrated them. It completely upended the psychiatric assumption that every hallucination is a pathology requiring heavy medication. The distress and the impairment are what make it a clinical issue, not just the sensory experience itself.
Man, if everyday people can have these experiences and function fine, it really exposes how damaging the cultural stereotypes are. If you watch any thriller or horror movie, the person experiencing psychosis is always portrayed as the dangerous villain. But the sources show that label has a very dark history of being weaponized, right?
A very dark history. One of the most glaring examples is the misdiagnosis of schizophrenia along racial lines in the mid-20th century in the United States. Historian Jonathan Metzl extensively documented this in his research on what he called the protest psychosis. During the civil rights era, the psychiatric establishment frequently took normal assertiveness or justified anger in black men facing systemic injustice, and they pathologized it. They labeled it as hostile or aggressive psychotic illness.
So the diagnosis was basically bent to serve social control, masking it as medical care. That's horrifying. It just goes to show the sheer weight of the dangerous psychotic label.
And we still see the echoes of that today. The public firmly links psychosis with violence, but the data unequivocally refutes it. If you look at the landmark MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment study from the 1990s, they found that people with psychotic disorders who are not using substances have rates of violence that are not meaningfully different from anyone else living in their same neighborhood.
Wait, really? So the entire Hollywood slasher trope is just statistically false?
Completely false. The elevated risk of violence only really appears when you add severe substance abuse into the mix, which, increases risk across the board, psychosis or not. What's even more tragic about this stereotype is the inversion of reality. People experiencing psychosis are vastly more likely to be the victims of violence, exploitation, and abuse than they are to be the perpetrators. They are vulnerable, not villains.
That reframing is so important. And getting this right, stripping away the stigma, understanding it as a state, isn't just an academic history lesson. The sources highlight that there are massive, real-world public health stakes right now.
Absolutely. Understanding psychosis as a temporary treatable state is crucial for handling modern clinical emergencies. Look at postpartum psychosis. It affects roughly 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 childbirths. It is incredibly rare, but it is a massive psychiatric emergency because of the rapid onset and the risk of harm. Tragedies like the Andrea Yates case in 2001, where she drowned her children while in a severe postpartum psychotic state, highlight why rapid screening and intervention for new mothers is so critical.
And the sources also point out a growing wave of drug-induced psychosis today, right?
Yes, we're seeing heavy impacts from methamphetamines and increasingly high-potency cannabis and synthetic cannabinoids. Large studies in the UK and Denmark have shown that heavy use of high-THC products, especially during early adolescence when the brain is still developing, significantly elevates the risk of experiencing psychotic episodes later on.
We've talked about the history, the mechanics, the dangers, but I want to end on the hope, because the research isn't just a list of warnings. There's been a massive breakthrough in how we treat this before it becomes a lifelong struggle.
This is the most optimistic part of modern psychiatry. In the 1990s, an Australian psychiatrist named Patrick McGorry established the Pacey Clinic. They focused on something called the clinical high-risk state, or the prodrome. They realized that full-blown psychosis rarely just drops out of the sky overnight. There is almost always a warning period.
What does that warning period feel like for a person?
It can last for months, sometimes a year or two. It's subtle. The person might start withdrawing socially, their grades drop, or they start having brief, self-limiting perceptual oddities, like thinking a shadow moved, or feeling paranoid for just an hour before shaking it off.
But just because you have those warning signs doesn't mean you're doomed to develop full schizophrenia, right?
Exactly. That is the incredible finding. Only a minority of people in this high-risk state, roughly 15 to 30%, actually transition into a full psychotic disorder. The vast majority do not. And more importantly, Magori and others proved that catching this early in the prodromal phase or during the very first episode drastically improves the long-term outcome.
So early intervention turns this from a life sentence into a manageable temporary crisis. It completely shatters that old 19th century idea that a diagnosis was just a permanent downward spiral.
It really does. Recovery is entirely possible, and it happens every single day.
So to synthesize this for you listening, psychosis is not a split personality. It's not a lifelong doom. It is a state. It's a check engine light for the brain, warning us that the dopamine salient system is misfiring and assigning intense meaning to neutral things. It exists on a continuum that any of us could touch, whether through sleep deprivation or extreme stress. And most importantly, when we strip away the Hollywood myths of the dangerous villain, we find a vulnerable human experience that is highly treatable.
And, looking back at the long history we've covered, I keep returning to that idea of the cultural pantry. The biological mechanism of psychosis stays the same, but the brain always borrows from whatever technology or mythology is in the culture to build its delusions.
Which leaves us with a genuinely fascinating and maybe slightly chilling thought for you to carry with you. If a 19th century judge built his delusions around cosmic catastrophes, and a 21st century patient builds theirs around the hidden cameras of reality TV, what happens next? In a future that is rapidly filling up with artificial intelligence, deepfakes, and hyper-realistic virtual reality, how will psychiatrists 50 years from now tell the difference between a broken reality filter in the brain and a world where reality itself is getting much, much harder to prove? Something to think about.